All right, Professor Barry here. Today we are I guess this week we're in week number 4. We've covered some ground, right? Started off beginning the term a little bit about just sort of what is popular culture, or thinking about the sociological perspective, functionalism, conflict theory, interactionism, kind of get some background on the theories. Then start to think about, well, how can we use these theories to examine and understand the social world? So the theories are tools, right? We have our each theory has different language system, different ideas, different perspectives, and we can take those perspectives and we can examine the social world through them. And it makes it for a much more detailed examination of the social world. It gives us a framework through which we can view and understand the social world. So we started off the term with that, and then we went into week number 2, started looking at, we had a couple different podcasts and started to go through what is popular culture, how do we think about culture, how do we think about American culture, the different influences on culture. So that kind of got us into that just sort of that language and that space of being able to define what popular culture is. And then the things that are shaping popular culture, ranging from business and industry, globalization, our own identities and who we are, shaping sort of how we engage in popular culture. So just some different elements there. And then last week was on cultural appropriation, and just trying to understand, okay, sometimes stuff going on in culture, it's contested, different meanings that are being attributed to things going on within culture itself. And some things that get appropriated and brought into the marketplace, that's the process of appropriation. Things that get brought into the marketplace and being bought and sold that are removed from its kind of cultural origins, and it's devaluing and disrespecting the history behind those cultural items, practices, items, whatever it might be. And now this week we move into cultural studies, which is this big umbrella of a whole area of academic focus that bridges different academic disciplines. So the goal for this week is, at least within the PowerPoint, our lecture is to define cultural studies, explain it. The article that you're going to read this week from Douglas Kellner, Cultural Studies, Multiculturalism, and Media Culture, is a great article that lays out the foundation of what cultural studies is. And then there's a film you're going to watch. You can either watch one or the other. One film is addressing Native American representations. The other one is addressing representation of Latinx actors within media. So it's called Watch Latinos Beyond Real, Challenging the Media Stereotypes. So it's dealing with these issues of representation and how we can start to understand them using our new theoretical perspective called cultural studies. So that's our focus. That's where we're going and what we're doing. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and start here. It's as I mentioned, that cultural studies is this overarching large area of academic focus that includes usually a few different academic disciplines. Oftentimes, cultural studies is connected up to literary studies. That's one application of cultural studies. Cultural studies comes over into sociology, maybe a little bit of anthropology. And you'll see why in a minute, why we draw upon, within the field of cultural studies, they draw upon various different fields of academic focus. Cultural studies is basically the study of culture and society. And it's studying cultural products more than probably subculture and groups, traditions, practices, and values and that stuff. It's more about kind of this idea of culture being produced and what are the kind of the vehicles or instruments or mechanisms involved in cultural production. And to do that, to get work and to approach things from this sort of lens requires background in history, understanding history of technology, history of markets, history of people, migration of people. I mean, all these different things that are historical influence matter. Then we have to kind of get into maybe get into sociology, start getting into political economy, start getting into thinking about identities, gender, sexuality, race, different aspects of creating meaning. So bringing this sort of sociological perspective and anthropological perspective forward. And then getting into the text itself, like the text, the item that we're looking at, whether it's film, music, or actual physical text, then there's another level of analysis. So now we kind of get into the area of literary studies, language studies, and that becomes another area that gets brought underneath this umbrella of cultural studies. So one of the reasons cultural studies kind of formed, we'll kind of get into this a little bit too, is that after World War II, there was a significant development and expansion of consumer culture. So think about like how we consumed information. If you just imagine in your mind, just sort of how we kind of go back, how we might have, received information, as well as not only like news and information or entertainment, sports, but things like advertising, and how, advertising is another part of that, and how that changed over the course of time. Okay, so this is a book. It's on the PowerPoint. It's called The Attention Merchants, and he provides a historical perspective going back to early newspapers in America, and the role that advertising played in I think it was the New York Sun was the first paper that figured out that rather than selling the paper, we're going to start to sell the ads and sell advertising space, and the story becomes a way to attract the viewer. And then the focus got shifted to this idea of placement of ads. And what Tim Wu does in Attention Merchants is basically walks through each of these like major time periods of change with the ways in which our attention as the public's attention is being sequestered or shaped, or the industry is trying to draw the public's attention. So going back to like early newspapers, then you kind of get into radio. Okay. So you get into like radio 1920s, the invention and development of the radio. Now we have a different ways of communication, different presence now of entertainment and information coming into the household. Programming is different than you could do possibly within a newspaper form. Advertising and marketing coming into a different way, being expressed through the radio form. Then move up to TVs in the 1950s. Now we get a visual form. So think about that power of shift for a moment. So before you have a visual form, now we have to contend with, we have visual forms in terms of representation, starting to think now about, people aren't at this time thinking about it for the most part, but looking back, thinking about, looking at representations of gender, race, class. Now we get these visual representations. Now it's like another part of our culture to kind of examine. And then we move into computer, with the advance of TV, right? 1950s, 1970s, 1980s, cable television, major shift, right? So the proliferation of new kinds of mass media outlets, new kinds of programming, channels. Then we'll talk a little bit in this lecture about some policy changes that shaped the production of news and media. And then kind of get into advanced smartphone, et cetera, technology that you kind of get into this contemporary world that we're in today, social media and all those influences, Facebook, gathering our attention, right? And to kind of go earlier, another analysis of advertising on our ways of thinking is Stuart Ewan's book, Captains of Consciousness, sort of about how the industry works to grab our attention. So we will kind of go down that pathway in a few weeks, starting actually in week number 6, start getting into advertising and branding and marketing. But that's why, cultural studies kind of gets us into this space why it's important to study culture is because so much of our lives is spent in that space of culture stuff, of production of culture from industries, whether that's marketing, advertising, film, music, news media. It occupies a significant place in a part of our lives, and it's a site of power and a lot of influence. This is just a chart here looking at how many hours people spend each day on the social media. And we can start to identify already, it's like, okay, with that amount of hours, and we start thinking about, okay, what are all the images that we see? How do those images kind of influence maybe my perception or individuals' perceptions of their own selves, of the world? Who's shaping that content becomes sort of another issue to kind of work with. And that's all this stuff that falls underneath the umbrella of cultural studies. One more thing before we kind of go on to the first theme, and that is, it's this big umbrella, And with any area of academic focus, you could have people, researchers, and people who are working in cultural studies. People have different niches, little areas that they focus in on, right? Somebody could be focusing only on marketing and advertising, historical, contemporary. Somebody's really interested in representations, the representational realm. Somebody's interested in, wow, what is who are the owners of production? I mean, there's all these different areas. So cultural studies is rich, it's big, it's large, it's a lot of things that are going on. And I think because we spend so much time in it, that's important to have tools, theories, and perspectives to help us become more informed and more aware of what's going on in that social world around us. The more aware we are, the more we can make decisions that align better with our own values and our own ideals, versus just kind of, just swallowing culture without thinking about it in any way. So our first theme we'll talk about is the social construction of reality, and then we'll bring it back, we'll bring it into popular culture. The social construction of reality is this perspective that goes back to Berger and Luckman, this book with that title in the 1960s. And in about 200 pages, they basically kind of lay out a theoretical framework, a theory of thinking about how meaning is constructed. So the idea is that nothing has any inherent meaning, but meaning is given to the material world, the physical world, our personal world. So meaning is given to it, and they break down like all these different processes that are involved in constructing reality, and how reality may be constructed, it may be deconstructed, reconstructed, and they get into sort of like the mechanisms process in which reality is being created. So humans are the creators of reality. So there is an objective reality out there, but it's the meaning that we give the reality is where we focus in the terms of social construction of reality, right? So we all have a biological self. We all have a gendered self, but gender is a social construct. The ideas in terms of our gendered self is shaped by social, cultural, historical factors. These are constructs that humans have assigned to the physical world itself. So maybe a different example, thinking about, let's say there's a natural disaster event happens. Well, that's the objective reality. But now all of a sudden we get into reporting on that objective reality. What images do we see about that particular natural disaster? What are the storylines, the storylines, the headlines? What does the coverage look like? Now we're starting to construct reality, right? So I may never have I've never visited that location where that natural disaster happened, but we're constructing a reality about that particular event. So that's one way to think about different protests over the last few years, or different events. Like, how is that reality being shaped? The meanings that we give these particular things. We tend to view the world through basically language and constructs, and the language and constructs are coming from whether institutions or the social groups we belong to that are shaping that reality. Eventually, there could be things that are that there's a strong agreement or shared understanding about things. And that's when these concepts or constructs become more stable. So ideas about heterosexuality, thinking about the heterosexual male, 1940s, 1950s, or even going back earlier. We could even trace back and talk about social construction of reality, that the term heterosexual doesn't even emerge into language, doesn't become a term until mid-late 1800s. And now all of a sudden we create this category called heterosexual. And part, it's this sort of dichotomy, right? So it's just sort of creating these two categories of homosexual and heterosexual in the mid to late 1800s, creating these constructs. For quite a period of time, these constructs had shared, agreed upon meaning among most members of society. This meaning became institutionalized. It became reinforced through all kinds of different institutions, including culture itself and the products of cultural institutions, reinforcing ideas of the heterosexual male and female. Then let's say 1969, you got Stonewall Inn, the riot at Stonewall Inn, that started the modern day gay rights movement. There's gay rights activism going on earlier in the 1950s, 1940s, but it's really like late 1960s, 1970s, where you get the Gay Liberation Front. You get this movement towards social change. In some ways, it's a movement to challenge certain ideas and certain constructions of sexuality, and to deconstruct and rebuild a new perspective, a new way of a new meaning system regarding sexuality. So that's maybe an example of that. Part of this constructed reality is the language that we use, right? So it's through language that we view and understand the world. So whoever thinking about who influences the construction of the world itself is, in part, it's who's controlling the language, who's controlling the story, or who's shaping the story. And it's not individuals or institutions, it's a collaboration between kind of the macro level and the micro level. And I bring this up just with the social construction of reality. It's going to start paying attention to language becomes an important part in this sort of system of creating meaning. I'm going to jump real quick to like the last slide, but just an example. This is different names of lipstick, and we'll come in here later, but different names of lipstick, is, this language system that we're giving the lipstick, right, is constructing a reality, a gendered reality, probably a class-based reality, well, maybe even a race-based reality in terms of that. Meanings may become institutionalized to the point they become viewed as reality. Thinking back, or we go back to sort of looking at heterosexuality, think about the invention of that terminology. It became institutionalized. That became viewed as the objective world, and people forgot that was a constructed world. And it's during moments of history when there's social change going on, oftentimes it's agents of change are challenging that dominant definition or that dominant constructed reality. Meaning is arbitrary, but it's real. So even though the world is socially constructed, the meaning that we give the world, the subjective meanings that are given to the world, even though that's arbitrary or that it's subjective, it's real, because if we believe it to be that case, we believe it to be real, then it's real in its consequences in that way. So then we can make a connection to popular culture, say, okay, well, how do we apply this to popular culture, you ask? And we can go, well, first of all, we think about the constructors, who's constructing meaning. That's all the way to the macro level, the government and government policies, institutions, the mass media, advertising, marketing, business. All that macro level stuff, the political economy, as you'll read in Kellner, like that's the political economy, all the way down to the micro level, you and your daily interactions. Like that is all part of the process of constructing meaning. So who's involved in shaping meaning? Say institutions and people. Institution, and we get to people, we're talking about, well, maybe the status or the position of those people, of different people within the social world, they have different degrees of influence on constructing that reality. So we can kind of go into the macro level and think about the cultural industries, and using that terminology is very purposeful. It's kind of like the language we use to talk about industries that produce cultural products, whether that's fashion, hats, shirts, or film, or media. Anything that's part of like that culture. It's the cultural industries that are producing product. We can look there from this sort of social construction of reality and say, okay, well, let's look at the demographics of those who are in various positions within those institutions of cultural studies. It makes sense. You start breaking it down and you think, okay, if everyone in those institutions, let's just look at the news media. If everyone who's a producer, a director, a newscaster, an editor involved in the industry itself, if everyone in that industry is college educated, and let's just assume for a second this is not the case, but just to create an argument or a perspective, that everyone in those positions actually came from a middle-class college educated background and had little contact with other groups above or below. So who's occupying those positions, their background becomes important because either knowingly or that may unknowingly or unknowingly shape the stories they tell or how they tell the story. It may shape, it may shape content, right? So the demographics of those who are in those particular positions may be really important. Also start thinking about the social construction of reality, and we're looking at the macro level in institutions, start to ask the question a little bit about, well, what is the mission, the goal, the objective of the institution, and how does that shape the content that's being produced? So if you have an industry that's looking to maximize profit, like, okay, that's going to shape to some degree the ways in which, the products that are being produced. It's going to shape content. And there may be degrees of influence on that focus on profit, and that degree of influence on the product itself. So there's, limitations. So, I mean, industries can, working to maximize profit. Yeah, there's also community, the sensibilities of the community that they have to, that industries respond to as well. And when, a company violates kind of a social expectation, some executive of a company makes a statement that goes over the line or out of bounds, there's consequences to that. So industries this becomes like, going back to, the readings from last week about Dr. Seuss books or Aunt Jemima, right? Is that part of, there are limitations. They're seeking profit, but they also have to pay attention to audience too. And there's a larger link to some of this kind of stuff of like who's involved in constructing reality to larger societal values or, values within society itself. So you can go to that macro level, and that would include things such as in 1980s, late 1980s, was the end of the fairness doctrine. So President Ronald Reagan vetoed a bill which would have protected the fairness doctrine. It started in 1949. The fairness doctrine became part of the mass media, the newscasting, and the fairness doctrine is you needed to give kind of fair, balanced perspective between opposing sides on a particular issue. So I put this image of Walter Cronkite, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s newscaster. There are three main outlets for newscasting, news programming: ABC, CBS, and NBC. That's the news. And so some people talk about it as the golden age of newscasting. Now there's some questions and some critique of that idea, but it was journalism that was much more fair and balanced. Again, it's not that there weren't issues going on within the industry at the time, but it didn't have, once you move away from this fairness doctrine and open up opportunities for news outlets to become ideologically driven. So have a news outlets on the left or on the right. So left being MSNBC or the right being Fox News. Now we have a new environment, right? Now we have almost like before, we had a more uniform constructing reality of the daily news. Now we have these sort of like two different kind of systems that are creating and constructing realities of day-to-day life and news. As the last couple of things about social construction of reality, it could be to different degrees of consciousness or awareness by directors, producers, the makers of the culture within the cultural industries. It could be that people are reproducing things within the industries without even know that they're doing it, right? So they think about who to cast for a specific position or a particular idea, not thinking about perhaps looking at through a lens of race, gender, sexual identity, lenses and perspectives, issues of equity and inclusion. Like these are maybe things that aren't being examined within the institution itself. It could be that the institution is very highly aware of what they're doing as well. So I just bring that up, that constructing reality doesn't have to be conscious, deliberate by institutions. I mean, institutions can be reinforcing a constructed reality without it necessarily being intentional. So what gets printed or filmed or recorded or aired, whatever it may be, may just be kind of market demands. I put quotation marks around it because market demands is like, okay, there's just a market for it. I think it's much more complicated than that idea. It's just responding to the market. The market's also being constructed and being shaped. So there's that particular component of that. So going back, okay, this construction of reality, different degrees of consciousness by those who occupy within the cultural industries, as well as among consumers, different degrees of awareness and consciousness about how kind of the media is being organized or what's going on in terms of reality being constructed. Provided a few different examples here to something to think about. So looking at racial representation in film, you can find a lot of different articles or information or data points looking at gender representation, representation of, of class, social class, which is really interesting to look at as well. And you kind of break down, okay, where's the objective reality and what's the represented reality? How far apart are they? How are people being represented? What roles do they take when they are within the TV or film? And those become more important kind of things. There's been some examination, and I had a chart I think I provided earlier in the term. This is just a reference to a write-up about the modern day newsroom. Still kind of there's some gender and race inequities that are going on within the newsroom. So go back into that idea of once, institutions are involved in constructing reality, who's in those institutions is important, but also it may not be just who's in the institutions, it may be the logic or the ultimate goal of the institution is a driver of content, regardless of who's occupying a position within that. And then as the last example is looking at, there's some commentary going on between media coverage of Black Lives Matter protest and January 6th and the Capitol siege or insurrection, even the language, right? We're sort of identifying what language we refer to that event that happened on January 6th. And making a comparison in terms of media coverage. And you can imagine media coverage is going to be starkly different between those two, right? Constructing different realities between the two, which leads us into the Thomas theorem. I mentioned it before, is that part of the social construction of reality can get into this idea that constructed reality is it's arbitrary, but it's real. And kind of gets into the Thomas theorem, which Thomas theorem, if you define something as real, it's real in its consequences. So this is the constructed reality, the way that we view the world or something, right? That influences, there's the actual objective world, there's a constructed world, and then there's our response. So the objective world may stay the same, but it's we're paying attention to is the construction or interpretation, because it's that interpretation that shapes our response itself. This is an example of, our first Federal Bureau of Narcotics was started in 1937, I believe it was, the first federal body that's regulating or addressing the marijuana menace that's going on in the 1930s. There's a lot of this sort of, we talk about it in social literature as a sort of moral panic of the day going on about marijuana and the concerns of marijuana. And Henry Anslinger was this moral entrepreneur who's advocating for harsher sentencing and punishment and criminalization of individuals who got caught with or using marijuana. And you can read through these different quotes from Anslinger, but he's constructing a reality. I mean, he's one agent among many who's constructing a reality of marijuana. Marijuana doesn't have any, there's an objective reality of marijuana, right? But it's these constructed meanings. Where'd I go with that? Let's get that smaller. It's the constructed meanings. So the marijuana, it's the constructed meanings that influence our response. With social construction of reality, we're kind of addressing all the way from the macro to the micro, who's involved in the construction of meaning, and being more mindful about what they say within the macro level about the organization, the influence of the organization itself, the demographics, who's involved in the construction of cultural products or the culture industry, and then getting down into our own interpretation, how maybe our own social position is shaping how we're interpreting the world as well. That's kind of the idea. Okay, so now let's kind of move into defining, this is theme number 2, defining what cultural studies is. And you're going to read more about this in the article, but I kind of lay a foundation kind of here a little bit, just kind of explain it, just give you another perspective about the cultural studies and what it is. In fact, let me actually go here first, and we'll come back to that. So let's say talk about where it started from. Cultural studies comes out in the 1960s. This is called the Birmingham Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies. It's this long, fancy name, but it's basically the cultural studies. That became the first center of cultural studies, and then it kind of expanded globally and became part of, we have cultural studies in the United States in different institutions of higher education. And part of, as I mentioned before, there was a significant advancement of consumer culture, youth consumer culture, television. Now we're going to get all kinds of different things. So the mediated world is becoming a more powerful space. And the cultural studies, British Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies was formed to basically understand this area that's having more and more of a role in our lives. It's a place where there's a lot of power. So if we're not examining it, it could be detrimental to the social body, to society itself. And part of the idea of cultural studies is that it understands that reality is being shaped, culture is being shaped by issues of power. I mean, who controls, who influences, who has a voice within institutions to be able to shape what's being produced in the culture industries. In that case, culture is a site of power, representations, images that we see, headlines that we see, stories that we see. They contain within them expressions of power relations regarding race and class and gender, political ideologies, religion, different parts of what's going on in the social world. And to challenge that, we have to become aware. So if there's things that are going on, within culture that are reinforcing elements of culture that are opposed to democracy and democratic principles, are violating democratic principles, we have to unpackage them, understand them first before we examine them. Part of cultural history or cultural studies is to contextualize things, to understand the influence of history, historical events, or understanding how history shapes cultural products or our meanings that we attach to things. So looking at putting things within a context, a historical context, a cultural or social context. Things are socially constructed. So going back to that, and recognizing that we are all active participants in receiving the reception of cultural products. So it's not that individuals just blindly or just take on or assimilate what's being provided to them through media outlets or that world of culture. People are much more, they can read stuff in different ways. They can look at something and maybe give a different interpretation, that we are all active participants in reading or receiving information from the media. And part of the cultural studies, it looks at that relationship between the macro level, the micro level, and the distribution of power within that. So let's kind of go to this now and kind of provide a model. Here's just sort of a model you could see. And again, Kellner's article you read for this week walks you through this, but basically, you have three different areas of analysis. If you're looking at something within culture, this is maybe the more macro level, is looking at how is that institution or institutions who are producing that thing, how is it organized in terms of the political economy of the organization? What are the demographics of those who are in charge of the organization? Who owns those organizations? What are the beliefs and the values and the ideologies that are like the central part of those organizations? So thinking about looking at sports, looking at, let's say, the NFL or the WNBA, all these issues of how things that influence the production of a game, let's say in televised form. And let's go back to radio, let's go back to TV, let's look at different time periods of the development and expansion of the NFL. And examination of new technologies, and how new technologies shape, how a game is shown, the availability to show games. I mean, it's all these different things that are much more macro level. That's the production of culture. And if we look at things such as changes in technology, that's part of the shaping the production of culture, right? Early newspaper, radio, TV, all the way up to contemporary technologies. How do these new emerging technologies shape content, area of production of culture? What are the demographics of people who occupy positions within culture industries, production of culture? Like those are all the kind of things that are part of that. The textual analysis, it's the text. It could be an image, that's a text. Could be, this is where you do literary studies, reading the text, the words, right? Or it's the visual text itself. So that's start to develop tools and strategies for how do we interpret text. If we go back to like a previous week where we had the triangle of meaning, we have the actual object, you have the symbol, and then you have the referent, right? The meaning that we give things. And what the textual analysis is trying to understand and analyze the text itself. Looking at gender and advertising, it's so rich with all kinds of stuff in terms of textual analysis of advertising and beer advertising, and we can find, they become looking at advertising, we get a lens into ideas about gender and society itself. Representations tell us something, that text tells us something about culture and dominant cultural values and ideals. And then finally, we get to the audience reception, how people interpret it. And a key here is that your social position influences how you interpret, never determines, but influences how you might interpret the text itself. So let's just say, for example, that, you and I both see gender in advertising, a beer advertisement. Your social position, whether that's age, class, educational level, all these different kind of things, becomes an influence on how you receive and interact with that particular text. It could be that we don't get too complicated here, but it could be that people interpret the text in a way that reinforces particular the dominant view and perspective, and we call that a hegemonic reading, where an audience member, individuals interpret the text in a way that reinforces some inequality. It could be that people they interpret it in an alternative way, where they read against the grain, we call it. And I just bring that up to say that audience members are active in their interpretation. They may read things in different ways, but their social position in terms of their race, their class, gender, sexual identity, different parts of who they are, region of the world they grew up in, whatever it may be, they may shape how they view the world itself. Here's an example. Okay, so I've sort of brought up, we could sort of tie all three together. This is an advertisement for Lunesta, pharmaceutical for people who have a hard time sleeping. It's a sort of butterfly image, have a hard time sleeping, and butterfly kind of image about that. Direct to consumer advertising, so advertising on whether that's the television or within print media, didn't start until the 1990s. Before that, it was not allowed, pharmaceutical companies were not allowed to advertise in the mass media. It was viewed against the public interest. But that changed in 1997. I think in large part, I would argue that's a large part due to a lot of lobbying by the pharmaceutical companies and industry itself. It also fits within our cultural belief system about sort of the free market, the free marketplace. But I want to say that the United States and New Zealand are the only two countries that allow for direct consumer ads for pharmaceuticals. Okay, so this is part of the political economy. Okay, what's going on in terms of whether it's policy level, institutions, and those kind of things that are shaping institutions and what they do. The textual analysis, as we looked at this, okay, I'm kind of doing a brief textual analysis. I wonder, okay, what's the gender of the individual? The gender of the individual, the race of the individual, how's that individual being represented? It's part of the text, the language, the butterfly. Like this is rich with kind of textual kind of analysis, sort of soft colors, right? Soft, dreamy colors kind of fit. And these kind of all kind of ways of marketing and influencing potentially our perceptions, our belief, constructing a reality with ultimately trying to encourage us to consume, right? To purchase this particular product. Audience reception, different people may, based on their position, their social position, may interpret that in different ways. It could be, I mean, I don't know, just give maybe like kind of a example that's pretty distorted or pretty out there, but let's say it's, an 8-year-old sees that, they're going to see that totally differently than somebody who's 35 versus somebody who's 18. So you can see where age is going to have a factor. And then start thinking about, well, how does, for these advertisements, if they're commonly advertised towards females versus, or that's the representation that we see more common, that our social position of being male or female may influence kind of our perception or how we read that particular text. Our awareness about direct-to-consumer advertisements, the role they play in our world and the power and the influence of them may shape how we see that as well. I mean, that's all kinds of stuff that are underneath that. Okay, so there's a couple supplemental things you can check out if you want this week. As I mentioned before, you can look at the schedule for the week. You have an opportunity to watch one of 2 films. Watch both of them if you want. One of them examines representations of Native Americans, and the other one Latinos and Latinas on film. This article by Shively, Cowboys and Indians, Perception of Western Films Among American Indians and Anglos, is a great classic study of audience interpretation and looking at audience demographics. And really interesting of how whites were interpreting, Westerns, John Wayne, primarily 1950s, 1960s, I think Westerns maybe a little bit earlier, but interviewing and actively interviewing individuals and say, okay, how do they understand the hero and what's going on, the narrative and the story? And that Native Americans were, their interpretation different, some similar and some different in terms of how they saw the Western. And really interesting to start thinking about how that social location influences how we interpret a text. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to read that, not required, but if you want to read that. And then there's a podcast about called Race and Culture Industries, what I thought is really thought-provoking. And one of the things he brings forward is kind of a production of culture example. And one of the arguments he makes is that if you look at the racial demographics of the newsroom or of a media industry, it could be that industry is becoming much more racially diverse and that people of color are occupying higher level positions within that organization. But that does not mean that the content's going to change. Because the driving force of those institutions shapes what stories are allowed to be told and how stories might be told. So he argues it's not that the demographics of the individuals don't make a difference, but it's rather trying to understand to what degree can they have an influence. And maybe sometimes we think they have more of an influence than not. And maybe it's the institution that's driving things more than individuals can within that. And then for a third theme, rather than me going through a third theme, this will be part of your assignment for the week, is I want you to take something, some cultural product item, and think about it through these 3 different perspectives. So identify the item and then go, go cultural production, textual analysis, and then audience reception. And then a brief description of what things you'd be thinking about when you looked at this particular thing through those 3 different perspectives. And then talk about what's the value or the importance of looking at, that cultural studies. What does it give us? What does it provide us? So I use the example here of lipstick and the color and the names of lipstick. And there's this is the text, right? A lot of gendered stuff. It informs us about gender and society itself, about ideals about gender. I'm thinking about the production system, marketing system, this political economy, who's making decisions about language. What are all the tools and techniques to get marketing and advertising, to get the product in front of people? That's all political economy. And then finally, audience reception, how different individuals may interpret the language of this text. Maybe this depends on, your age may shape your race, your class may shape what the language and the meaning you assign to these particular lipsticks. And then I thought about, as an example of gender, it's like a products, condoms and language around condoms, ideals about masculinity that are wrapped up in that. I mean, sort of similar idea. Okay, so that's the focus for the week. It's a great area of examination, cultural studies. It's a rich body of research and academic work. It is, like as I kind of mentioned before, it's an area we spend so much time in. yet we know little about. And cultural studies, the focus of cultural studies, understanding it and understanding the kind of tools of cultural studies, I think become really helpful in informing us about or giving us tools to examine that social world. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great week and enjoy the readings in the film for the week.